Philadelphia, the 27th of June, 1936. Franklin Field. 100,000 people gathered here, the air thick with the smell of summer, sweat, and popcorn. This is the Democratic National Convention. Everyone is craning their necks, staring at the massive stage, waiting for their hero, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to appear. But backstage, hidden behind a heavy curtain where no one can see, a silent war is being waged. President Roosevelt is sweating profusely. He is gripping the arm of a Secret Service agent so hard his knuckles are turning white. For an ordinary person, the distance from backstage to the podium is less than 10 meters, about 15 steps, maybe 10 seconds. But for Roosevelt, these 10 meters are like climbing Mount Everest. Only a tiny inner circle knows that the leader of this great nation has absolutely no feeling in his legs. Supporting him are not muscles and bones, but 2 pairs of heavy steel braces weighing 7 pounds. These cold iron bars strap from his ankles all the way up to his groin. To stand, he must lock the mechanical joints at his knees, forcing himself upright like a compass. With every move, the leather straps dig deep into his flesh. Just seconds before he goes on, disaster strikes. As Roosevelt turns to reach for his speech, his center of gravity shifts slightly. With a sharp click, the lock on his right knee brace snaps open. It is a catastrophic moment. Losing his support, Roosevelt falls backward like a felled tree. Thud. The most powerful man in the world crashes onto the dusty floor in a heap. His speech papers scatter everywhere. His glasses are knocked askew. Agents and advisors rush around him in panic. If the press outside snaps a photo of this, if those 100,000 voters see this, Roosevelt's political career is over. The myth of the strongman would shatter instantly. But in the midst of this chaos, the man on the floor does not scream. He does not panic. He simply commands, in a cold, undeniable tone, "Clean up those damn papers. Then, get me up and lock these braces." 2 minutes later, the curtain rises. President Roosevelt walks onto the podium, beaming. He waves his hat, his smile brilliant, his eyes determined. The cheer from the 100,000 people almost blows the roof off. No one knows that this giant waving to them was lying helpless on the floor like a child just 2 minutes ago. No one knows that behind every smile there is the excruciating pain of steel cutting into flesh. This is the story we are telling today. It is not just a story about a disabled man. It is a story about a masquerade. For 12 years, before Hitler, before Stalin, and before the American people, Roosevelt performed the greatest and most painful act in human history. He used a broken body to play the role of an invincible steel giant. And this great deception ultimately changed the history of mankind. To understand why Roosevelt had to put on this show, we must first look at who he was before he put on the mask. Rewind to before 1921. Back then, Roosevelt wasn't exactly likable. You could even say he was a bit annoying. Born into one of New York's most prominent families, he was the nephew of President Teddy Roosevelt. Handsome, tall, wealthy, a Harvard graduate, he sailed smoothly to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At that time, he was a typical political vase. Arrogant, flighty, fond of expensive, flashy suits, he walked with his chin held high, barely deigning to look at those below him. To him, the world was a giant playground, and he was born a player. His political skills were immature, relying solely on his family name and that pretty face. But God seemed to think that such a man was not fit to save the world, so God decided to break him. August 1921, Campobello Island, Canada, the Roosevelt family summer retreat. After helping put out a small forest fire, 9-year-old Roosevelt jumped into the freezing ocean for a swim. Upon coming ashore, He felt a strange chill, a coldness seeping from his bones. That night, a high fever struck. The next morning, when he tried to get out of bed, he was horrified to find his left leg wouldn't obey him, as if the sinews had been pulled out. By afternoon, his right leg lost feeling too. 3 days later, he was completely paralyzed. From the waist down, dead weight. The doctor's diagnosis was a single, cold line: poliomyelitis, polio. For a rising political star who branded himself on vitality and movement, this was crueler than a death sentence. The man who used to dance best at the ball now needed a nurse to carry him to the toilet. The man who once looked down on the masses now had an eye level permanently fixed at everyone else's belt buckle. Roosevelt collapsed. He shut himself in his room for 2 whole years. Those were 2 years of hell. The physical pain was secondary. The loss of dignity was the real killer. Think about it. A 39-year-old man in his prime, once so proud, now needing to be cared for like an infant. The shame was enough to destroy anyone's will. His mother, the domineering Sarah Roosevelt, even started arranging his afterlife, not a funeral, but the funeral of his political career. She urged him, "Franklin, let it go." But in this darkest moment, 2 key figures pulled him back from the cliff edge and taught him his first lesson in power. The first was his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. In the past, Eleanor was a shy, even insecure housewife who hated the spotlight. But to prevent her husband from rotting away, she unleashed an amazing energy. For the first time, she stood firm against her powerful mother-in-law, refusing to let Roosevelt retire. She told him, "If you retreat now, you are truly dead." To prove Roosevelt was still alive, Eleanor forced herself to overcome her social anxiety and became her husband's body double. She began frequently attending union meetings and women's clubs, giving speeches where Roosevelt couldn't go. She was his legs and his eyes. Her actions told everyone, Roosevelt hasn't fallen. He is still in the game. The second was his political advisor, Louis Howe. Howe was a small, ugly man who looked like a ghost, but possessed a brilliant mind. He looked at Roosevelt, lying in bed with a dead heart, and said something incredibly cruel but profound. He said, "Franklin, your legs are gone, but maybe this is a gift from God. The old you was too shallow. You didn't understand real pain. Now, you do. If you can conquer this, you won't just be a politician. You will be a king." These words woke Roosevelt up. Eleanor held the fort outside. Louis Howe rebuilt the ambition inside. Yes, if he wanted to return to politics, he couldn't be a cripple in a wheelchair. In this cruel jungle, no one votes for a weak man. If he couldn't actually stand up, he had to act like he was standing up. And so, the arrogant rich boy died. A deep, complex master of disguise was born in the fires of pain. He accepted the challenge. He rejected his mother's advice to retire and instead turned his eyes to Warm Springs, Georgia. There, he would begin a brutal, secret rehearsal that would last 7 years. He was going to forge a steel corset for himself, preparing to stage the greatest deception the world had ever seen. If you think Roosevelt's 7 years in Warm Springs were just about practicing walking in front of a mirror, you underestimate the man's ambition. From 1924 to 1931, these 7 years were actually Roosevelt's political laboratory. Warm Springs wasn't his sanatorium. It was his first micro-kingdom. When Roosevelt first arrived in Warm Springs in 1924, it was just a dilapidated, failing southern resort. But he made a decision that everyone thought was insane. He drained most of his savings, borrowed money from every family member he could, and spent nearly $200,000 to buy the entire place. Why make such a losing investment? Because he didn't want to be a pitiful patient. He wanted to be the master here. It was a brilliant psychological compensation. In New York's social circles, he was a disabled man needing pity. But in Warm Springs, he was the boss, the developer, the god of the place. He personally designed wheelchair ramps, some of the earliest accessible architecture in U.S. history. He drew blueprints to renovate the pools. He even taught himself physical therapy and started guiding other polio patients. The patients here didn't call him former assistant secretary. They called him Doc Roosevelt. You see, this is the mutation of power. Even in a wheelchair, he had to hold some form of dominion. It was also here that Roosevelt evolved his most terrifying weapon, his charming personality. This was actually forced upon him. Before the paralysis, Roosevelt was arrogant. If he met someone he didn't like, he would just walk away. But now, he couldn't walk. If you are sitting in a wheelchair facing a boring visitor or a complaining farmer, you can't run. You have to learn to endure, to listen, to control the situation with a smile, to diffuse awkward topics with humor. More importantly, because he couldn't walk toward the crowd, he had to become a magnet that pulled the crowd toward him. He perfected his signature kilowatt smile, head thrown back slightly, chin up, showing perfect teeth, eyes locking onto the other person. Psychologically, this posture was a strong suggestion. I am confident. I am strong. Come to me. During those 7 years, countless Democratic heavyweights, Southern politicians, and even passing commoners were invited to dine at Warm Springs. Roosevelt sat at the head of the table, carving turkey, pouring wine, and telling jokes like a godfather. From his wheelchair, he built a massive human network. Politicians who once looked down on his disability would leave dinner with a delusion. This man's legs may be gone, but his mind is sexier than anyone's. 7 years of rehearsal. Finally, the audition. 1928. Houston. The Democratic National Convention. Roosevelt was to nominate Al Smith for president. This was his first appearance on a national stage since his paralysis. If he failed, he would be a joke. If he succeeded, it was the return of the king. For these few minutes, he started hellish training months in advance. Backstage, he didn't use the wheelchair. He strapped on the heavy steel braces and covered them with loose trousers. When the host called his name, the whole arena held its breath. Roosevelt, leaning on a cane, gripped the railing with one hand and began his performance. The Roosevelt Gate debuted to the public. He locked his knees, used his upper body to swing violently, throwing his dead legs forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He was sweating profusely, every move accompanied by agonizing pain, but his face wore that famous happy warrior smile. When he finally reached the podium and gripped the edges with both hands, he seemed to unload his entire body weight onto the wood. He threw his head back and boomed out his first line. The delegates went wild. Thunderous applause. They didn't see a cripple. They saw the triumph of the will. In that moment, Louis Howe, hiding in the wings, wept. He knew Roosevelt had won the 7-year gamble. The man who was once broken was now ready for the White House. Except for those legs, he was stronger than anyone. Let's fast forward to March 1933. America was in a state of clinical death. The Great Depression had been raging for 3 years. If you walked the streets of New York or Chicago, you would see a horrifying sight. Banks were locked, crowds banging on doors, waving passbooks, screaming for their life savings. Factory chimneys were cold, machines rusting, 1/4 of the workforce unemployed. In the countryside, farmers dumped unsold milk into ditches, and shot their livestock, while city dwellers stood in breadlines. It was a completely paralyzed nation. No money, no jobs, and worst of all, no hope. In this darkest hour, Franklin Roosevelt rolled his wheelchair into the White House. History played a massive joke. The American people elected a paralyzed president to save a paralyzed economy. But as we said before, this was Roosevelt's greatest weapon. Because he knew that he knew that when you are lying in bed unable to move, you don't need empty slogans, you need concrete, forceful action. The first thing Roosevelt did shocked everyone. He didn't hand out money. He didn't give a speech. He pulled the plug. The day after his inauguration, he signed Executive Order No. 1, declaring a national bank holiday. It sounded insane. People were panicking because they couldn't get money, and you closed the banks. But this was Roosevelt's brilliance. He knew the banking system was a patient hemorrhaging blood. If you don't stop the bleeding, no amount of transfusion will help. He used the holiday to rush the Emergency Banking Act through Congress, printing currency to inject blood into healthy banks and amputating the rotten ones. After stopping the bleeding came the psychotherapy. Sunday night, the 12th of March, 1933. 60 million Americans gathered around their radios. Through the crackle of static, they heard Roosevelt's voice. This was the famous fireside chat. Previous presidents spoke from high podiums, shouting down at the people in theatrical tones. Roosevelt completely upended this. He had a table set up near a fireplace in the White House, with sandwiches and water. He sat in his wheelchair, and even though the braces were uncomfortable, he relaxed his body and spoke into the microphone in a low, magnetic baritone, like an old friend chatting. "Good evening, my friends." Notice he said "my friends," not citizens. That one word bridged the distance of 1,000 miles. In this chat, he didn't use obscure economic jargon. Like a patient teacher, he used plain language to tell anxious housewives and unemployed workers. Why did we close the banks? How does money flow? Why is it safer to put money in a reopened bank than under your mattress? This communication was a masterstroke. He deconstructed a complex financial crisis into a household ledger everyone could understand. More importantly, his voice carried a startling calmness. A calm born from 10 years of fighting his own pain. Listeners subconsciously felt, this man endures paralysis. He must know how to handle this crisis. The effect was instant. When banks reopened, a miracle happened. People didn't line up to withdraw money. They lined up to deposit it. That day, over $1 billion flowed back into the banking system. With just one speech, Roosevelt rebuilt America's faith in finance. Of course, talk alone doesn't save a country. After stabilizing morale, Roosevelt showed his efficiency as a dictator. This was the famous 100 days. If you thought Roosevelt was a gentle Democrat, you're wrong. In those 100 days, he bulldozed 15 major bills through Congress. Are you young and jobless? Fine. Roosevelt created the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The government gave you a uniform, food, and housing, shipping hundreds of thousands of young men to the forests to plant trees and build dams. Low pay, but you had food, dignity, and you weren't rioting in the streets. Are you a farmer with low grain prices? Roosevelt created the AAA Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The government paid you to reduce production, to leave fields fallow, forcing prices up. Do you live in the flood-prone Tennessee Valley? Roosevelt created the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the biggest infrastructure projects in history: dams, hydropower, irrigation. Roosevelt's logic was simple. The government is no longer a spectator. The government will be the biggest employer, the biggest capitalist. Even if these policies were economically rough or even unconstitutional, in that moment, action itself was hope. As he said, "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." Amidst this roaring reform, Roosevelt still needed to maintain his strongman image. This is why we keep coming back to his performance. In every tour of dams or factories, Roosevelt's classic pose was sitting in the back of an open-top car. He wore a heavy coat to hide the leg braces. One hand gripped the door handle for leverage, the other waved his trademark fedora high, his face beaming with infectious confidence. As the motorcade passed, people saw a red-faced, energetic leader. They cheered, they threw their hats, they felt that as long as they followed this man, America was saved. But no one saw that under the heavy coat, his thighs were being cut by steel straps. No one knew the muscle spasms his lower back endured to maintain that upright posture over bumpy roads. Every wave, every smile, was a battle of will against physical agony. This was the art of Roosevelt's leadership. He used his broken body to absorb all the pain and showed the strongest, most optimistic face to a broken nation. He fooled everyone, but he succeeded. By 1936, industrial output returned to 1,929 levels. Unemployment began to drop. The paralyzed nation, supported by his large hands, finally stood up, trembling. But history gave Roosevelt no time to breathe. Just as America stepped out of the ICU, war clouds gathered across the ocean. Hitler's tanks were rolling. Japan's warships were launching. Roosevelt was about to face not economic figures, but a life-or-death gamble for human civilization. This time, he had to stage an even bigger show. When Roosevelt cured America's paralysis at home, he soon realized the real show was just beginning. The 7th of December, 1941, Pearl Harbor. For Roosevelt, this was actually a massive relief. Before this, he had exhausted every political trick to drag an isolationist America into the war. Now, Japanese bombs did the final mobilization for him, but there was a huge strategic risk. It was Japan that attacked. Logic dictated America should seek revenge in the Pacific. But Roosevelt's strategic eye was sharp. He had long decided on a Europe-first strategy. Nazi Germany was the true heart of the threat. Japan was just a skin disease. The problem was how to convince angry Americans to fight Germany. Fate helped him again. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler made the stupidest decision of his life. He declared war on the United States. Roosevelt seized the moment, revving the war machine to full speed, sending troops to both the Atlantic and Pacific. By 1943, Roosevelt's health was deteriorating. Long periods of sitting overburdened his heart. Doctors diagnosed him with congestive heart failure, but he had to travel. The anti-fascist alliance was about to fall apart. In the East, Stalin's Red Army was bleeding its last drop. Stalin furiously accused the US and UK of watching the show, demanding a second front in Western Europe immediately. The British Prime Minister, that old fox Churchill, kept stalling. He didn't want a head-on collision in France. He wanted to attack from the south, through Italy or the Balkans, to cut off Soviet expansion into Europe. Stalin threatened, if there is no second front, the Soviet Union might make a separate peace with Germany. To prevent the alliance from collapsing, Roosevelt decided to drag his broken body halfway across the world to Tehran, Iran, to glue these two enemies together. It was a logistical nightmare. To transport the paralyzed president, the U.S. Navy converted the battleship USS Iowa into a floating palace. Engineers installed a massive elevator between decks just so Roosevelt could move in his wheelchair. The craziest part was the bathroom. Roosevelt couldn't shower standing up. So, the Navy installed a special bathtub in the captain's quarters. A bathtub on a battleship unheard of. Even so, the journey almost turned into a disaster. As the fleet crossed the Atlantic, an escort destroyer, the USS William D. Porter, accidentally fired a live torpedo at the USS Iowa. When the alarm sounded, chaos erupted. Everyone thought it was a German U-boat. Secret Service agents drew their guns to shoot the torpedo. They rushed to the president to stuff him into a special floating pod, an escape capsule designed so that if the ship sank, the president would float. But guess what Roosevelt did? He didn't panic. He excitedly ordered his agents, "Quick, push me to the rail. I want to see the torpedo." Luckily, the Iowa turned hard, and the torpedo exploded in the ship's wake. Roosevelt watched the water plume and smiled like a child. That was the man. Not just an actor, but a gambler dancing on the edge of a knife. After the harrowing journey, Roosevelt arrived in Tehran in November 1943. The Big Three finally met. It was a high-stakes killing game. Roosevelt knew the cards. Stalin had millions of soldiers. Churchill had the prestige of the empire. Roosevelt had American industry and an unfathomable mask. To woo Stalin, Roosevelt made a shocking decision. He didn't stay at the U.S. Embassy. He stayed at the Soviet Embassy. The excuse was security against Nazi assassins. But he knew perfectly well that every corner of the Soviet Embassy, even under the toilet seat, was bugged by Stalin. He didn't care. He wanted to perform for Stalin. "I trust you more than I trust Churchill. I am putting my life in your hands." At the conference table, Roosevelt turned his wheelchair disadvantage into a static, central power. He positioned himself in the middle of the round table, Stalin to his left, Churchill to his right. Facing Churchill's endless sales pitch for the Balkan Plan, Roosevelt coldly ruled against him. He sided with Stalin. The reason was realistic. Landing in France, overlord, was the fastest way to beat Germany. To shatter Stalin's paranoid defenses, Roosevelt decided to publicly sacrifice Churchill's dignity. At a formal dinner, the atmosphere was stiff. Stalin was hostile. Roosevelt suddenly started roasting Churchill. From his wheelchair, he exaggeratedly mimicked Churchill's cigar-chomping grumpiness, mocked him as an old Victorian antique, ridiculed his accent, and poked fun at his imperialism. Churchill was stunned. He never expected his special ally to humiliate him in front of the Soviets. His face turned red, his brow furrowed, the cigar trembling in his mouth. But this was exactly what Roosevelt wanted. Stalin watched Churchill squirm and finally burst into laughter. He laughed until he shook, even standing up to toast Roosevelt. In that moment, Stalin felt, "This American is one of us. He's not with that arrogant Brit." So, how did Roosevelt handle Churchill afterward? He didn't apologize. He met Churchill privately, not to say sorry, but to lay his cards on the table. With cold calmness, he made Churchill understand a cruel reality. "Winston, times have changed. The British Empire is bankrupt. You owe us billions. You don't call the shots anymore. We need the Red Army to grind down the Germans. If I don't keep Stalin happy, this war never ends." Churchill was a brilliant politician. Though humiliated, he swallowed it. He knew Roosevelt was right. Britain was now a supporting actor. To survive, the proud British lion had to bow its head and accept Roosevelt's teasing. Amidst the laughter and swallowed pride, a brutal deal was struck. First, the US and UK promised to launch Operation Overlord in May 1944. This was what Stalin wanted most. Second, in return, Stalin promised to attack Japan after Germany fell. Third, and darkest of all, Roosevelt tacitly accepted Soviet control over Poland and the Baltic states post-war. Did Roosevelt know this would condemn Eastern Europe to the Iron Curtain? Of course. But he was a realist. The Red Army was already at the Polish border. Unless the US was willing to fight the Soviets for Poland impossible at the time Eastern Europe was effectively Stalin's. Since the outcome couldn't be changed, better to use it as a chip to buy Stalin's cooperation in the larger game. This was Roosevelt's manipulation. With a frail body, amidst laughter and jokes, he pushed the British Empire off the center stage and sold the interests of small nations to get the Soviet bayonets to do America's dirty work. When the conference ended, Roosevelt collapsed in his wheelchair, face pale. He had just completed a tightrope walk of the highest difficulty. He succeeded, but he was spent. Death was standing right behind him. Next, he had to go to Yalta for the final, most tragic performance of his life. January 1945. By now, Roosevelt was effectively a walking dead man. If you check his medical records, they are terrifying. His doctor, Howard Bruin, noted, "The president's face is a deathly gray, lips purple. His heart, from long-term strain, is swollen like a football. His blood pressure spikes to 300/170, a number that means his blood vessels could burst like high-pressure hoses at any moment. Any sane doctor would order bed rest. No movement." But Roosevelt refused, because the final act, the Yalta Conference, was about to begin. This wasn't just a meeting. It was to determine the post-war world order. The UN? Dividing Germany? When would the Soviets hit Japan? If these weren't solved, millions would have died in vain. Roosevelt knew this was a suicide mission, but he had to go. Dragging a heart that could stop at any second, he traveled 8 days by sea and air, halfway across the world to Yalta. Churchill was shocked when he saw him. He wrote, "I no longer saw the giant of old. Opposite me sat a translucent ghost." During meetings, Roosevelt would sometimes trail off into silence, mouth hanging open. Stalin saw this and was pleased. He thought the old fox was finally done. So, Stalin refused to budge on Poland. Was Roosevelt senile? No. Even on the edge of collapse, his brain was calculating. He knew he lacked the energy to fight Stalin on every border detail. He pushed all his chips onto 2 goals. First, the Soviet promise to declare war on Japan, saving 1 million American lives. Second, the Soviets must join the United Nations so the post-war world wouldn't immediately fracture. To get these, he compromised on Eastern Europe. Some call it a betrayal. In Roosevelt's math, it was trading space for time, trading Eastern Europe for a US-led global order. The conference ended. Roosevelt got what he wanted. The price, his life bar hit 0. The 1st of March, 1945, Washington. Roosevelt reports to Congress on Yalta. Usually, this is a moment of high drama. He should wear the 7-pound braces, be helped to the podium, and stand like a god to receive applause. It was the act he had performed for 12 years, the foundation of his strongman image, but this time, something shocking happened. When the doors opened, Roosevelt didn't stand. He was wheeled in. For the first time in his life, he chose to deliver a major public speech sitting down. The proud Roosevelt, who would rather die than sit, finally admitted he was tired. Into the microphone, facing hundreds of stunned congressmen, he spoke his famous opening. "I hope that you will pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say, but it makes it a lot easier for me not to have to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs." This was the only time in his life he publicly revealed his scars. In that moment, the mask of the steel giant shattered. But in that moment, he received the most sincere applause of his career. Everyone realized the man on stage wasn't just a president, but an old man who had burned his own flesh and blood as fuel for his country. It wasn't a speech. It was a testament. 1 month later, the 12th of April, 1945, Roosevelt returned to where he started Warm Springs. He wanted to rest and prepare his speech for the founding of the UN. That afternoon, he sat for a portrait by Elizabeth Shumatov. While she was sketching his tie, Roosevelt suddenly raised a hand to his forehead. With a pained expression, he whispered, "I have a terrific headache." His hand dropped. He fell unconscious. A massive cerebral hemorrhage. 2 hours later, the most powerful heart in the world stopped beating. The portrait became known as the unfinished portrait. In it, Roosevelt wears a gray suit and red tie, looking deeply into the distance. But the painting has no end. Just like the New World Order, he designed grand, but full of regrets and unfinished missions. News of his death plunged America into grief. As the funeral train moved slowly from Georgia to Washington, thousands lined the tracks. Black, white, old, young. Many wept without knowing why. A reporter asked a crying black man, "Did you know the president?" The man wiped his tears and said, "I didn't know him, but he knew me." End quote. If you not say the president of Five of Line, and he state as reporter, a reporter asked a crying black man, "But he knew me. I didn't know him severely." This was the life of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A playboy, a cripple, an actor, a manipulator. He spent his life weaving a massive lie, pretending to be strong. But in the end, you find the lie was the truth. Because true strength isn't about whether you can stand and walk. It's about whether, after being shattered, you can pick up the pieces and carry the world. April 1945. The war was almost won. The director in the wheelchair quietly left the stage just before the curtain fell, but the script he wrote still rules the world today.